Brian May once revealed something about John Deacon that was more painful than any rumor. John had not vanished completely. That would almost have been easier to understand. He was still connected to Queen, still consulted about important decisions, still entitled to express approval or opposition. His name remained part of the machinery behind the band, even while the man himself stayed far away from its stages, interviews, celebrations, and reunions. Think about that for a moment. John Deacon did not destroy the bridge, he simply stopped walking across it. For years, fans tried to explain his absence with dramatic theories. Some believed he had fallen out with Brian May and Roger Taylor. Others imagined bitter arguments over money, musical direction, or the decision to continue performing under the Queen name. Those explanations are attractive because they give the story a villain. But Brian's own words point towards something quieter and perhaps more difficult. John did not want the stress of being creatively involved. Brian and Roger respected that boundary. Even though the personal distance remained painful, major decisions could still reach him through management. Messages could come back. Approval could be given. Just not friendship in the form it once had. That detail usually gets lost. People often describe John as if he disappeared the moment Freddie Mercury died. He did not. He stood at Wembley for the tribute concert. He returned to the studio. He helped complete Made in Heaven. He performed with Brian and Roger again in Paris in 1997. He tried, and I think that matters more than the convenient claim that grief immediately drove him into hiding. The real story may be that John stayed long enough to discover something he did not want to admit. Playing Queen's music was possible without Freddie, but being Queen without Freddie was something else entirely. You can hear the difference. One is technical. The songs still have chords, arrangements, harmonies, and recognizable bass lines. The other is personal. Freddie had been the unpredictable force at the center of the room, but he also created a strange kind of balance. Brian could be meticulous, Roger could be forceful, John could withdraw. Freddie moved between them, provoking one moment and softening another. When that presence disappeared, the band did not merely lose its singer. Its internal gravity changed, and John, perhaps more than anyone, felt the shift. He had never seemed hungry for the role of rock legend. Even at Queen's commercial peak, he often looked like a man standing slightly outside the mythology being built around him. Watch the old interviews, Brian explains. Freddie performs. Roger reacts. John waits. Then someone asks him a direct question, and he answers with a few careful words. That restraint was once treated as shyness. Later, it became mystery. After Freddie's death, people began calling it damage. But there is another way to see it. Silence may not have been what happened to John Deacon. Silence may have been the one part of his life he had always chosen for himself. The painful truth Brian May eventually revealed was not that John had forgotten Queen. It was that he remained close enough to care and distant enough to survive it. And that leaves us with a harder question. What exactly happened during those final years that made distance feel safer than returning? There is a photograph from Queen's later years that says more than most interviews ever did. Freddie Mercury is at the center, naturally. Brian May is turned toward him. Roger Taylor appears alert, ready to respond. John Deacon stands slightly apart, watching. Not excluded, not uncomfortable. Simply observing the room before deciding whether he needs to enter it. That was John's position inside Queen for years. He was the quietest member, but quiet did not mean passive. He noticed tension. He understood money. He knew when an arrangement needed less, not more. And when the louder personalities collided, he often avoided making the collision worse. Freddie understood that instinct. This is where the usual version of the story becomes too simple. People say John was devastated because Freddie was his closest friend. Perhaps he was. But friendship alone does not explain why continuing with Brian and Roger became so difficult. Freddie may also have been John's interpreter. Not in the literal sense. John could speak for himself. But inside a band driven by powerful egos, Freddie seemed to understand when John's silence meant agreement, when it meant resistance, and when it meant he had already withdrawn from the argument. That distinction matters. Without someone who could read him, John's quietness may have started working against him. Imagine returning to the studio after Freddie's death. The microphone is still there. The tapes contain a voice that sounds alive. Brian and Roger want to preserve the music, complete unfinished recordings, and protect the band's legacy. All of that makes sense. But to John, every technical decision may also have carried another question. How much should the living change what the dying man left behind? Most accounts focus on the achievement of Made in Heaven. They speak about the care, the engineering, and the emotional weight of finishing Freddie's final recordings. What they rarely discuss is how unnatural the process must have felt. The band was working with Freddie's voice, but without Freddie's judgment. He could no longer interrupt a session, reject an idea, laugh at something too serious, or insist that an imperfect performance contained the right emotion. His voice remained in the room, while his authority had disappeared. For Brian and Roger, completing the album could be understood as an act of devotion. For John, it may have felt like standing inside a conversation that had already ended. I do not think this means one side loved Freddie more than the other. That interpretation is too easy and unfair. Grief does not produce identical behavior. Some people preserve everything, some rebuild, some speak constantly about the person they lost. Others cannot bear to hear the name spoken in a room where that person should still be sitting. You may recognize that difference from your own life. The same loss can pull one family closer and make another person disappear. Neither response automatically proves greater love. Sometimes it only reveals what each person can endure. John continued playing. He recorded. He appeared when the occasion seemed important enough. Yet something had changed in the way he occupied the band. Before Freddie's death, John's silence had existed inside a relationship. Freddie could reach across it. Afterward, that silence became a wall. Brian and Roger may have seen a colleague becoming increasingly unavailable. John may have seen two men attempting to continue something whose final chapter had already been written. And here is the uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps John did not leave because Queen had become unbearable. Perhaps he left because Queen still felt familiar enough to remind him every single time of the one person who was missing. The final performance is often described as a clean ending. It was not. In January 1997, John Deacon joined Brian May and Roger Taylor in Paris for a performance of The Show Must Go On with Elton John. On paper, the moment looked ceremonial, a famous song, a tribute, musicians sharing one stage. But look at the choice of song. A man already pulling away from Queen was playing a piece built around the command to continue. That irony is difficult to ignore. Most viewers saw a reunion. John may have experienced something closer to confirmation. The music still worked. The audience still responded. Brian's guitar still carried force. Roger still drove the song forward. And yet, the essential absence remained. This is where public perception and private meaning separate. To the audience, the performance proved that Queen's surviving members could stand together again. To John, it may have proved that standing together was no longer enough. He did not announce his retirement that night. There was no dramatic speech, no farewell interview, no staged final bow. That would have made the story easier to package. Instead, he left quietly. That part feels entirely consistent with the man himself. John had spent years contributing crucial ideas without demanding the central position. He could write one of the band's biggest songs, solve practical problems, shape the rhythm of a recording, and then step backward while someone else explained what had happened. So perhaps his retirement was not an abrupt transformation. Perhaps it was the final expression of the same instinct. He had always known when not to add another note. Soon afterward, John returned to the studio for No One But You, the only Queen song recorded by the remaining members after Freddie's death. The title itself sounds almost too precise. It was a song about those who leave too soon, performed by three men who had not agreed on what continuing should mean. John completed his part. Then he stopped. Brian and Roger continued building a future around Queen's music. John protected the past by refusing to participate in that future. Neither response was simple, neither was painless. But when people ask why John Deacon walked away, they often search for one explosive argument. The more revealing answer may be that there was no explosion at all, just a man reaching the end of a song and recognizing before everyone else that his part was finished. After John Deacon retired, the public began searching for signs that something had gone terribly wrong. A rare photograph would appear in a British newspaper. John carrying shopping bags, John walking near his home, John dressed like an ordinary man rather than a member of one of the most successful bands in history. The photographs were usually presented as evidence of decline. "Look what happened to him," the headlines seemed to say. But what exactly were people expecting? A limousine? A leather jacket? A permanent costume proving that the bassist from Queen still existed beneath the grey hair? John's appearance changed because time passed. That should not have been surprising. Yet celebrity culture has a strange way of treating natural aging as a personal collapse, especially when the person being photographed refuses to perform happiness for the camera. John did not smile for photographers. He covered his face, changed direction, continued walking. To some observers, this looked sad. To me, it looked like a boundary being enforced. That does not mean his life after Freddie was painless. Brian May has spoken about how deeply John was affected by the loss and how completely he withdrew from the social life of the band. Roger Taylor has admitted that they have had very little direct contact. There is genuine sadness in that distance, but sadness is not the same as ruin. This is where the familiar narrative becomes unfair. John left public life, so people assumed public life had rejected him. He stopped performing, so they decided he must have lost his purpose. He chose privacy, and privacy was interpreted as evidence that he was broken. Perhaps that says more about us than it does about him. We are comfortable with musicians who continue until their bodies force them to stop. We celebrate farewell tours that become second farewell tours. We admire artists who return after years away because the comeback reassures us that fame remains irresistible. John offered no such reassurance. He had the money to live extravagantly, the reputation to command attention, and the catalogue to keep himself visible forever. Still, he chose the local street over the red carpet. Most people would call that disappearing. John may have called it going home. Brian and Roger continued Queen's music with other performers. Their decision allowed new generations to experience those songs live. It also kept Freddie's work present in public culture. John took the opposite approach. He preserved his memory of Queen by refusing to recreate it. There is tension between those choices, certainly, perhaps even disappointment. Brian has never hidden that he wishes John were more present. Yet he has also made clear that John's position is respected, and that major decisions still pass through him. That is an overlooked contradiction. John is absent, but not erased, silent, but not powerless, separated from the men, yet still attached to what the four of them built. So when Brian speaks about John's life after Freddie, the painful truth is not simply that grief drove him away. It is that the surviving members learned to carry the same loss in incompatible ways. Brian and Roger moved forward by keeping Queen alive. John moved forward by allowing his version of Queen to end. There is one final detail that changes the way John Deacon's story should be understood. He never asked the public to understand him. He did not write a memoir explaining what Freddie Mercury's death did to him. He did not sit beneath studio lights and describe his disagreements with Brian May or Roger Taylor. He never launched a solo career to prove that Queen had underestimated his importance. He did not even offer the kind of carefully prepared retirement statement celebrities usually release when they want to control the final version of their story. John simply removed himself from the conversation, and because he refused to explain, everyone else began explaining him. Fans called him heartbroken. Newspapers called him reclusive. Some imagined that he hated what Queen had become. Others described him as a man permanently frozen in the moment Freddie died, unable to move forward while Brian and Roger continued without him. That version is emotionally powerful. It is also incomplete. Brian May's comments over the years suggest something more complicated. Yes, Freddie's death affected John profoundly. Brian has never tried to hide that, but the painful truth may not be that John stopped living after Freddie died. It may be that he stopped allowing the public to watch him live. Those are not the same thing. One describes collapse. The other describes control. John had already given Queen more than 2 decades of his life. He had endured relentless touring, internal disagreements, financial uncertainty, recording sessions that stretched far beyond reasonable hours, and the strange pressure of becoming globally recognizable while possessing almost none of the qualities normally associated with celebrity. He did not appear to enjoy being watched. He enjoyed the work. That difference is easy to miss. John could spend hours refining a bass part, examining a contract, or finding the precise rhythmic idea a song needed. But when the work was finished and the microphones turned toward the band for an interview, he often seemed ready to disappear behind the others. The public interpreted that as shyness. Perhaps it was something more deliberate. Even during Queen's greatest years, John appeared to understand that attention and importance were not the same thing. He did not need to dominate a room to affect what happened inside it. He wrote songs that became enormous hits. He helped stabilize the band financially. His bass lines gave movement to records that might otherwise have become overcrowded by guitars, harmonies, and theatrical ambition. Then he stepped back. He had always known when not to add another note. So when people ask why he did not return for one more tour, one more interview, or one more reunion, perhaps the question itself reveals the problem. What exactly was John still required to prove? That he loved Freddie? That he respected Queen? That his songs still belonged to him? The audience often assumes that a performer belongs to the performance forever. Once a song becomes attached to your youth, your marriage, your grief, or your happiest memories, it begins to feel personal. You no longer hear only the musician's work, you hear part of your own life. That connection is real. But affection can quietly become entitlement. Fans wanted John to return because seeing the surviving members together would make the story feel less broken. It would create the illusion that time had not completely changed them. That Queen could still be restored even briefly to something close to its original shape. John refused to provide that illusion, and perhaps that is why his absence continues to disturb people. Brian and Roger chose a different path. They kept the music alive in public. They performed with new singers, entered new eras, reached audiences who had never seen Freddie, and allowed Queen's songs to exist as something more than preserved recordings. Their decision required courage. Continuing under the Queen name meant living beneath constant comparison. Every new performance invited the same question. Was this still Queen? Could anyone stand where Freddie had stood? Was celebration becoming imitation? Brian and Roger accepted those questions because continuing gave them purpose. John found purpose somewhere else. That does not make one choice more loyal than the other. It means grief divided them without necessarily turning them into enemies. Most stories about bands depend on conflict. Someone becomes greedy. Someone betrays the others. Someone says the unforgivable thing. That gives the audience a clear emotional map. But relationships do not always end through anger. Sometimes people survive the same event and discover they can no longer survive it together. That may be the most uncomfortable interpretation of Queen after Freddie. Brian and Roger needed movement. John needed stillness. They protected the same history in opposite ways. Brian and Roger protected Queen by allowing the songs to continue breathing in front of audiences. John protected his version of Queen by refusing to participate in a recreation of something he believed had already ended. There is pain in that difference. Brian has spoken with respect about John's withdrawal, but respect does not erase personal disappointment. You can understand why someone stays away and still wish they would call. You can honor a boundary and still feel hurt by the distance it creates. That may be the real painful truth behind Brian's words. John was not completely gone. He remained connected to Queen's business. Important matters could still reach him. His approval still carried weight. His songs remained central to the band's legacy. He was absent but not erased. Silent but not powerless. Close enough to protect what the four men had built, yet too distant to participate in the friendship that once surrounded it. That kind of separation is harder to accept than a dramatic feud. A feud can be resolved, an apology can be offered, a misunderstanding can be corrected. But what happens when no one is necessarily wrong? What happens when one person continues because it is the only way he knows how to honor the past, while another leaves because continuing feels like a betrayal of that same past? There is no perfect reconciliation for that. Perhaps the saddest part of John Deacon's story is not that he rejected Brian and Roger. It is that he may have loved what they shared and still been unable to remain close to it. That sounds contradictory, but grief is full of contradictions. You can preserve someone's belongings and refuse to enter their old room. You can listen to their voice once a day or never listen to it again. You can keep speaking their name, or you can protect yourself by allowing silence to form around it. None of those responses measures love accurately. They only reveal what each person can endure. John endured by leaving, and then he accepted the consequences. He accepted that people would misunderstand him. He accepted that rare photographs of an aging man walking near his home would be presented as evidence of tragedy. He accepted that every Queen anniversary, documentary, film, or major concert would revive the same question. Where is John Deacon? He knew the world was waiting for an answer. Still, he offered none. That silence may not have been emptiness. It may have been the answer itself. John had spent his career in a band famous for excess, drama, spectacle, and the command that the show must always continue. Yet his final act was remarkably restrained. No grand farewell, no spotlight, no final demand to be remembered. Just a man deciding that a completed chapter did not need another page, simply because the audience wanted one. And I think this is where John's story stops being only about Freddie Mercury. It becomes a story about the right to leave a former version of yourself behind. The John Deacon who stood beside Freddie belonged to a particular arrangement of personalities, trust, conflict, humor, and musical instinct. When Freddie disappeared, that arrangement disappeared with him. John could have remained on stage, but remaining on stage might have required him to perform not only the songs, but also a version of himself that no longer existed. So he chose not to. The world kept waiting for a comeback because comebacks make better stories. They provide closure. They tell us that the past can be recovered if enough time passes and the right people stand together again. John Deacon offered something less comforting. Some endings remain endings. Some losses change the meaning of everything that follows. And sometimes the deepest loyalty is not expressed by continuing at any cost. Sometimes it is expressed by knowing when the music has already said everything it needed to say. John refused the encore, not because Queen meant nothing to him, because it had meant too much.